So Figgy CTZ asks, what is your favorite game genre and why? And has it changed the last 30 years?
It's probably not changed. I guess my favorite arcade or my favorite genre would be arcade action type stuff. Like I kind of put a lot of arcade action games into one big category because like stuff like your Donkey Kongs, your elevator actions, everything. I love that stuff. I also love fighting games, so I'd put that. I mean, I guess that's a category.
Right. Your genre is very wide.
I like action. I like twitchy, actiony fun. That's what I like. How about that? Like things I don't get into that much are like, and obviously with a few exceptions of graphics adventure games or like.
So you hated like
games.
Queen of the Desert on Coco. Couldn't stand it.
I never played those a ton. I did. There were some Coco games I get into, but that was all the games I had. That's the difference. You asked me what my favorites were. They weren't my favorites. Popeye was something like that. I like that.
So
stuff.
like arcade games.
Arcadey games. That's my stuff. Mm-hmm. And the Amiga's got quite a few of those, and not really shooters either. What about you? What's your? I mean, you like a whole different set of stuff.
Things have definitely changed for me over the past 30 years. So when I was growing up, probably from the time that I was from when I started playing video games all the way up until probably college, I wanted really, really deep experiences. I liked, twitchy arcade games. I played a lot of arcade conversions on the Atari and the Nintendo and stuff like that. But my big thing was role-playing games. I was not good at traditional video games. Like I could never beat Super Mario Brothers or something like that. And I appreciated the fact that a role-playing game, you didn't have to have really good resources. You just had to have a lot of time. You could level your character up and you could beat this game no matter what. I also liked the complex systems in games. I was never a big PC role-playing guy, but even like games like Final Fantasy, it was a much deeper set of rules than a Super Mario Brothers or something like that. And when I did play PC games, I really liked games like SimCity and stuff like that, strategy games. I loved games that had really thick manuals that had, that you could really delve into and you could really say that you've mastered the mechanics of this game. However, once I started in college and became more, I had to adjust the amount of free time that I spent on playing games. I started to shift more towards the kind of games that you like, and that continues to this day. So I like a game that I can jump in and out of really quickly. I don't have, if I start to get into a game, like I've always thought, I wish that I could just pause time whenever I did anything that was entertainment. So I'd love to watch, like Wagner's The Ring Cycle, which is 16 hours long. But I just think about 16 hours, that's a huge time commitment that I could be doing something else in. And I feel guilty when I put that much time into something. I would love it. I would love to play the new Final Fantasy 14 or whatever. I think it would be a lot of fun, to jump back in and see what's different. But I know that I would feel guilty about the amount of time I'd have to put into it.
Yeah, we totally differ on the games. I like those games. I don't like at all. I could never console Japanese role playing games. I never could get into them. I'm not saying they're bad. It's just not my bag. The best I could do was like a Bard's Tale or Eye of the Beholder, and even those. I come from a role playing background, and I always thought they were left wanting of the actual role play. Like, at least one thing about Japanese role playing is you're not going to go out and play a D&D module that's like Final Fantasy, for example. But you could play some that were just like what you were playing in Bard's Tale and Eye of the Beholder. And if you didn't have a party to play with, those were okay. But I would rather just play with the actual people. So yeah, I guess that's why they were going to.
I think if I were going to get into something like that, I would much rather spend the time to really learn a pen and paper role playing system. I think that would be much more rewarding because the social interaction is there. Though also, the older I get, the more I appreciate video games as a social activity. Just being together with your buddies, because that's something that doesn't happen as much when you get older because people are busy, they've got families and stuff. So.
When you get real old, though, you're back in.
Right.
So I'm looking forward to once I hit 58 or whatever.
That's 18.
That's when I unleash the beast right there.
That's awesome. We got one more question from Paul. This is Paul, not Paul Harrington or Paul Kitching. This is another Paul. I don't know his last name. He's from Twitter.
McCartney.
Paul from Twitter. It's Paul McCartney. He says, hello to you both. I have a question for the podcast. If Amiga had if this is difficult to say.
What language does Paul speak?
if the Amiga had continued to grow and was still around today, what do you think it would have evolved into?
If it was still, read that. Well, you distracted me with your wackiness. So read it one more time.
If the Amiga had continued to grow and was still around today, what do you think it would have evolved into?
Well, it would probably be a lot. I hate to say this. It would probably be a lot like what the Mac has evolved into, or Windows. And what would that be? A walled garden with a because where's the money at now? It's all online. It's all paid apps, stuff like that, paid games. It would probably be something like that in terms of the OS. I think they would have kept, because the Amiga OS obviously could be refined. It's been done. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I'm not saying it would be exactly the same setup, but I think that's where the money would be. I think that I mean, even the new ZX Spectrum is going to have a store element, right? And so I think that's the common thread. All right. In terms of hardware, I wonder if they could have ridden the Motorola. Motorola would have had to come up with some new stuff that would be in line with, like, I mean, you'd have to keep up with the Joneses, and you've got to have you got to have something that's in the same level as an i7, or something that ballpark, something really fast, and so you'd have to have something like that. So for Amiga to have continued, a Motorola would have had to have stayed very active in the PC market, which they have to a certain degree, and I think you would have had more success in the States. I don't know if a computer could have progressed. I mean, because Windows now is pretty much a worldwide phenomenon, and Mac to a certain degree, but Windows, we're talking about the big dog, and so it's everywhere. It's not, and so computers aren't splintered like they were, in most countries. I'm sure in maybe some Middle East or somewhere like there might be they might have some local market computers, but most people use a Windows PC, right? So you're going to have Amiga would have had to have stretched out and been more dominant in America. They would have had a better showing over here, and so that would be part of it, which would be great. You could see why it went out, and it went out because Commodore was asleep at the wheel, right? And so what would have had to have happened is Commodore would have had to have been. I always wonder what would have happened if Atari had ended up purchasing Amiga like they had planned. We all have heard that tale at the last minute, and I remember seeing the guy tell the story about how they screwed over Atari, and Trammell was off, blah. But I mean, really, what would have happened if Atari would have had Amiga technology? There would be no ST, right? And then so there would be that element gone from the equation of competition. Then you would have Amiga would be a more dominant factor in Europe for sure. And the ST did nothing in the States, so I don't know how much that would have affected their performance here. But Atari had a pretty good rep, a pretty good name. You would have had some action there. Would it have been? I mean, I think Ataris were more ingrained in the educational system here than the Commodore 64 was. So there's an element that thinks maybe you can get Amigas in the schools. But then again, the Mac got into a lot of schools, and the Mac's not really a huge player now, so it didn't have that big of an effect. So it's difficult. It's a difficult thing to. Well, I mean, I'm just spouting off. What do you think?
I think that if let's pretend like Amiga had like people that knew what they were doing at the top.
All right.
So let's throw all that stuff. Let's just pretend like they've got the ultimate team of people making decisions. They could have positioned the Amiga as what the Mac was trying to position itself as from the beginning. So instead of just trying to really say, well, we're not really a games machine, but we actually are a games machine because we realize that's why people are buying our thing. If they would have said, listen, we've got D-Paint, we've got desktop publishing, we've got the video toaster, we've got the ultimate multimedia machine for you if you run a production company or if you're involved in the arts at all. If they would have taken that angle from the top, then Apple, with their little 9-inch black and white screen, would have been a lot harder for them to get a foothold.
Yeah.
Because there's only a year difference in the launch of the Mac and the launch of the Amiga, and the first actual usable Mac didn't come out until about the time that the Amiga was launched anyway. Because the first Mac launched without enough RAM. Even the demo Mac had twice the amount of RAM that it eventually shipped with. So, they had a foothold. They had a way to differentiate themselves against the PC, which was the juggernaut. If they would have taken that tack, but the problem is that they always walk the line between, is this a glorified game console or is this a productivity device? And Apple, probably for the best, always position themselves as, no, this is a business machine. We don't. I'm sure there are people making games for it, but we're never going to talk about it. You never saw the Batman pack for a Mac.
Yeah, you're right. It's funny, and I'm no Apple fan. And I'm not, I don't use a Mac. It's funny that I own one, but part of me is very envious of the Mac people and the Apple computer people, and I don't mean the snooty ones or the upper crusty ones. I'm talking about your hardcore Apple people that have been with them from the jump street, because they have got to experience what I didn't get to experience. Is they took their little tiny computer and they've been able to ride it all these years. I mean, and Apple has not exactly done them any favors a few times.
Right.
And even to this day, it's not exactly doing them a lot of favors. It's tough to be a hobbyist, Mac user.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you've been able to ride that wave all this time, and it would be so. And you're always the underdog, and that's sort of the Amiga community was a lot like that. We're they're the ones that. We don't got Windows. We had to put up with a bunch. We got a joystick with one button. We had to, there was a lot of stuff. But I mean, that it really, and there's still that's why the Amiga community is still a tight, friendly bunch. Is because we're all the long-suffering. Our planet exploded. Now we're just cast into space and we're just banded together. And I'm jealous that those people got to embrace that system for as long as they have, and continue to show their fandom toward it. A functional, active system, and we're getting a little taste of it now that Amiga hardware is sort of kind of in production, and there's sort of new stuff going on. It's kind of fun, but there was a long drought where there was not much going on, and it was tough. It was real tough, and where the Mac, they pretty much always had something cooking. So I will give them that.
It's funny you mentioned that, because we're just now celebrating the 20th anniversary of the launch of the original iMac. And of course, the iMac in many ways was not an ideal computer, but there were a lot of really important things that the Mac pioneered that we still see in computers today. For example, it was the first computer that launched with nothing but USB ports.
I remember.
And at the time, people, where's my parallel port? I can't hook up my printer.
Did they sound like Hicks when they wanted a parallel port?
Hicks. Everybody that was using a parallel port was from West Virginia. Man. I don't know if you knew that or not.
No, I didn't, because that's astounding.
And of course, the big thing, which is there was no disk drive. There's only a CD drive.
Yes.
And so, at the time, people were like, well, that's never going to take off, but here we are 20 years later, and the iMac is still going. And you can look back, there's a continuity with Apple. You can look back and say, well, this was a horrible decision. Apple did this and this and this wrong. But at the same time, you can say, well, if you owned one of those back in the day, there's a certain amount of nostalgia where you see, rose-colored glasses, and you see things that if you look at the iMac, when I look at it, I'm filled with a sense of nostalgia, because I remember when it was new, and I wasn't a Mac person in 1998, but I still wanted one because it looked so different, and of course there were all the copycats that came out after it was launched, and you had all these horrible PCs that were translucent and stuff, but I have a certain...
And they were more usable, unfortunately, because they had all the ports. Listen, I have no love for the iMac. I thought it was a piece of garbage. They were cheap. They were ugly. People loved them. This is just me personally.
Sure. And I mean,
the lack of ports, just like Apple always does. We're the innovator. Well, we're getting rid of ports. People are still using these ports back in those days.
Sure.
People needed a floppy drive.
Yeah, and there were Apple people that were ticked off too, because remember.
They were gimmicky. Ignore that.
The iMac was only one of the machines in Apple's line, but people were scared that the Pro machines were going to go that way. And you know what an ADB port is? ADB was Apple's proprietary USB port. So they sold a billion accessories that were ADB compliant. That suddenly, if you spent $6 million on all these things, if you have an iMac, you're screwed, you know? And so, but it is, like you said, it's interesting that you can see continuity in a way that you really can't, even with, you know, with Windows machines. You look at the tower that you had in 93 or 94, 95, it still looks like that same tower that you have now.
And one thing I will, again, here I hate to shower the Apple with praise, but the Apple and the Amiga have a lot in common. And one thing is, they don't look like a PC. They look like their own thing.
Yeah.
When you look back at your old computer from, say, 20 years ago, right? It's a beige, generic-looking gimmick, you know, or maybe you bought a Gateway. I mean, they're just, you don't have, it's not like, boy, I love that machine. It looks so pretty. Unless you're like the guy from LGR who has these affinity fields. For me, I look back, like I never, like when it was time to chuck a motherboard out of an old beige box, that sucker was gone.
Right.
It was never coming back, right?
Yeah.
And when you were done with that video card in the old days, that's a chuck it. You know, and so I would take the same box and I would just use it for decades.
Right.
Because the guts didn't matter. I wasn't like, boy, I can't. But like when here I am, I almost bought an Amiga 1000 this week. It's a beige box, but I mean, it's an Amiga. It looks different. It is different, you know.
Yeah.
And you're not chucking boards and putting new boards in that. I mean, that was the Amiga.
And that's why, you know, I know that you weren't a big fan of the Walker design, but that was something that was different.
It was.
You know,
I like to have one.
It's kind of like the Mac Cube or something like that. You know, it may be dopey and completely non-functional, but hey, when you look at it, you know it's not a PC. You know.
Yeah. And so I guess I will tip my hat to the anniversary of the iMac. One thing about it is, and there were plenty, and you're right, it was copied. And obviously the iMac wasn't what I would call, I can't remember, was Jobs there when the iMac was put out?
That was the first thing that he launched.
Yeah, and you can tell it's his kind of gimmick. You know, it's ahead of the curve to a fault, right? It's made for people that sometimes will look at style over substance, right? And but I mean, you can't deny the fact that it was ripped off by everyone.
Another thing, you know, the I in the iMac stands for Internet. It was one of the first PCs that shipped standard with a LAN connectivity and the modem built in.
And that's a place where Windows dropped the ball early on, where Bill Gates didn't think the Internet was going to amount to anything. So I have to give the devil his due occasionally.
Yeah, so well, it's an important milestone in computer history, whether you like Apple or not, and it's worth talking about because we're on Insert Disc 2 and we got to talk about something.
But that ringing endorsement, take it to the house, boat.
All right, guys, we'll see you next week.
Adios.